project that we did was the writing of 12 shadow reports on exactly what the situation was in the United States on those 12 key areas of concern. So those were written, those are up on our website. We can put the link in the chat, but the information from those shadow reports was basically called from government reports and NGO reports on what things were and were not happening on those things. The survey was meant to be a complement to that, to find out exactly how the women felt. Women of various ages from across the country, how did they personally feel about the effects of how important the Beijing platform itself was, how they felt those things had or had not changed in 30 years, and what things they saw going forward that needed to be improved now. So I think that's why we thought we wanted to make sure that we had not only the reports that the government was saying, but also the individual reports. Now, Graciela Soto was in charge of the project. She designed the survey, and she's got the results here today. So just to give you a little bit of background, if you don't already know Graciela, Dr. Soto is a clinical associate professor at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx. She specializes in internal medicine and critical care. She's also a member of the CSW New York and a UN representative for the Grail Link United Nations Network, which is an NGO that empowers women and girls to achieve their full potential in partnership with the Working Group on Girls. And we are very proud to have her as a member of our board. Now, Graciela will take some questions. You can put the questions in the chat, do that after. But I'm going to turn it over to Graciela.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Pam, and I'm very excited to actually join the results that all of you contributed a little while back, and I'm sure you're eager to see the results and how we can apply to our grassroots work. So let me just share my screen. Can you see the screen, everyone? Okay. So let me wait. This is now. No, 1 second. There we go. All right. So first of all, I want to thank everyone who is currently on the call and everybody who was in the survey subcommittee and who helped drafting, evaluating, and refining this survey, and also everyone who distributed the survey not only to their own NGOs but also to women, girls, and people that advocate for women and girls' rights. Without their help, we couldn't have accomplished this. So overall, my first slide here shows the distribution by different demographic factors and the total number of participants. So we sent the report to about, I would say, almost 30 NGOs across the United States. So it's pretty representative. It's not only representative for the East Coast or the West Coast, it's across the US. And out of all we had about 285 responses. And if you look at the distribution here on the right on the age, we can see that about 3/4 of the respondents were over the age of 50, which we kind of get a reply back from most of the more seasoned participants in advocacy from the organizations. But we were able to get about 14 girls who responded to the survey who are also advocates within the United Nations through the Working Group on Girls. And the importance of this is because these 14 girls are very knowledgeable on the Beijing platform, and we're already engaged on the Beijing +3 efforts and initiatives coming out for the CSW 69. So part of the way the survey was designed, if you remember when you were filling out the answer keys, it was not only to capture the sentiments and the progress or the priorities in terms of areas of concern for the 12 for the Beijing platform. It was also designed to analyze and collect information in different subgroups, which I think is important because not every subgroup has a similar perspective, and certain areas of concern, let's say education or health or poverty, does not affect at every person in every state or every population group the same way. So it was important to capture their voices. So we had about 16 women who had been in the Fourth World Conference in 1995. In terms of racial distribution, we had about 75% that were white or Caucasian, and the other 25% what we consider minorities. So we had about 27% were Black, we had multiracial, we had Asian Pacific Islanders, and we had Mexican Americans. So all these other 25% was considered minority groups. And we look at this subset in the analysis. In terms of ethnicity, we had about 19 or 7% that were Hispanic. In terms of vulnerable groups, we had about 40%, which was 83% of the respondents. Now, vulnerable groups was defined according whether they were self-reported indigenous populations, disabled, or immigrants. For single head of the household, we had about 40 or 14% of respondents. These were people that self-reported as either single parent with children or divorced or legally separated parent with custody of the minors. Then we look at about 60 people who live in the rural areas. That's about 21%, basically 1/5 of the sample of the survey. So rural area was defined according to the federal definition of anybody living in a town or city with less than 50,000 population or 50,000 people. And we look specifically at these subgroups. So we look not only responses by looking at all 235 respondents, but also by subgroups of women who were there in 1995, minorities. We look at vulnerable populations, single head of the households, those living in the rural areas, and also, even so there were only 14, we look at the girls. So we look at 6 subgroups, in addition to looking at all responses. So moving along. So the first one, we're going to talk. So one of the first questions, which is what Pang mentioned, is what is the amount of progress in each critical area of concern over the past 30 years? So you recall the survey, it had every single one of the 12 areas of concern, and you had to rate it from 0 to 5, which was no progress or the most progress. And the next table coming up actually shows a report. So here we look at no progress, which was 0, some that was 1, and more that was 2. But when you look at this, I have this in different colors. We can see that among all participants, about 1/3 of the respondents report there was absolutely no progress in armed conflict. And between the other 11, from poverty all the way to media, we have a different percentage of respondents for each one of them. So you can see that about 40% reported some progress in poverty and human rights. And then in terms of moral areas of concern, it's about 30% of responders each was rating some moral progress for each of the other ones. So I found this interesting because you would think it will be poverty or violence to have absolutely no progress. And it caught my attention that it was actually armed conflict. So I went back and I looked at the Beijing platform and the 6 objectives. And I looked at the report that was written by Dr. Altiok, who wrote the report on armed conflict. And it discusses how within the United States, none of the objectives have been met for the Beijing platform, specifically looking at the $9 billion of expenditure in military defenses, which is a significant amount of money, which is 40% of military expenditure from high political powers. How there's no engagement of women, American women, on any peace talks or in conflict resolution. There's a presence for women in other countries in peace talks, but not on that. And there's always the issue of the WPS agenda and how that's not very well instituted within the United States, only outside the United States. And now who knows with the new changes with the current administration, but also discusses how we has 3 women who have been secretaries of states over our 3 terms. But none of them actually, including Hillary Clinton, supported conflict resolution in terms of protecting human rights of children and women out in the conflict areas outside the United States. One of the other objectives was providing social protections to women and girls or children who are in conflict zones in terms of protecting them from gender-based violence, sexual abuse, and protecting their human rights and protecting refugees bringing refugees to our country but how none of this is actually supported within the United States initiatives, either locally or internationally. So that actually rings a bell. I think to me, being a physician, it opened my eyes about how significant this issue is within our country and the lack of representation of women, not only in leadership, but through other organizations for conflict resolution and peace building initiatives. I think that's where this comes about. So in order to do that, I said, well, let me look at what I did later after this is I look at the data by subgroups. I look at the numbers by the 6 different subgroups. I look at armed conflict. I look at poverty. I look at human rights and violence. And the two that I really come out across dramatically was armed conflict again and violence. So on the next slide, when I can't do this here, when we look at the lack of progress specifically over 30 years, and we look at subgroups on the left in terms of the issues of armed conflict, we can see that specifically what is important here is the opinion of the women who were in Beijing 30 years ago, because they have seen over the last 3 decades the progress or lack of progress of this particular issue. And we can see that more than half of the women that were in Beijing actually rated the armed conflict as being completely without having any progress over the last 30 years. That's almost 60%. And then we see that the other subgroups only is like the rural communities or the vulnerable, the single head of the household. They only about 40% of each of these groups rated a lack of progress in armed conflict. So what really is important is the opinion of the women who were in Beijing 30 years ago, how that really stood out. Then you look at gender-based violence. And what is interesting here is looking at the rural community and the girls and how these two subgroups actually rated the highest in terms of no progress for gender-based violence within the last 30 years. Now, if you review the comments that were actually submitted by all of these women and girls specifically, and overall in all the subgroups, the type of gender-based violence that come across all the subgroups and all the participants is the trafficking of women and girls. That really comes across. So the second question was, so we need to rank, so what are the areas of concern ranked as very important in our community today? So yes, there's no programs on the third, on armed conflict and violence, right, and health over 30 years, but what's happening now? Yes. Questions? So when we look at this, okay, so the top 3 areas that are critical for across the United States for all participants is health, specifically body autonomy and reproductive health rights. We kind of expected that. We have over 50% or so. And the second and third are the violence against women and education and training being as very important. So again, when we look at subgroups, we see a common theme, but we also see other things, other areas of concern that are significant from the perspective of different subgroups. So when we look at the ladies in Beijing in 1995, yes, it's the issue of violence, okay, but it's also the rise of the girl child that stand out. And this is rated by about 2/3 of the respondents from the women in Beijing in 1995. When you look at girls, yes, they talk about education and health and power decision-making, but really what concerned them the most was the issue about human rights as very important in the United States today. And then looking at the vulnerable, the rural, and the minority, especially vulnerable and the rural communities, again, is the violence and health issues. Looking at minorities, there's a key emphasis on education. Also, if you look at their comments and the quotations that the minority groups specify, and specifically among the minority groups, they talk about how they have encountered barriers because of socioeconomic status and poverty to access education. And the single head of the household, which is probably something that you will expect, is not only issues about health, but also the issues of economy, which makes sense if we know how the higher rates of poverty and the lowest rates of access to healthcare and more need of Medicaid is among single women who take care of children. All right, so they are the ones that are more significantly impacted in a negative way, but all these concerns about lack of about economic support, lack of career, and I'm going to show you some of the quotations from this particular group, but what's significant for them is not only the payback, but it's also the ability to work full-time and find protections or social services that help them with family leave and daycare and protection of their children while they're actually, so they can be able to work full-time and be out of the house. So one comment that I want to make is when we do research projects and we come up with an idea that we want to test as a hypothesis and we collect data and we design surveys and we do analyses, we know that our data and our numbers and the information that we obtain from our research project like this one, right, the survey data, we see that this is valid or is validated when the trends that we expect to see are validated by the information and the numbers that we get. Right, so you're going to see that trend actually in the next few slides when we talk about other issues. So then one of the important questions that we had is, and as you probably remember this, we had to rate what are the top 3 areas of concern that need to be addressed in the United States within the next 5 years. And this survey was done between 2024 and 2025 because we're looking at what can we address by 2030 for the sustainable agenda for United Nations, right? So what do we need to worry about or concentrate our efforts? So for this particular data that I'm showing on this table form, I got the help of 2 young girls and 2 young women that joined the U.S. Women Caucus Youth Group. And we look at the data over the summertime. So we counted the top 3 areas of concern. You look at the first row, you look at all participants, we can see that health is rated as number 1 by half of the participants. Then you have violence, which is about 40%. And then, then you have the economy or the issues of women and the economy, meaning the pay gap differences, parental leave, protection services, and all of that. Then you're looking by subgroups and you look specifically at the top 1 or the number 1 area of concern to be addressed within the next 5 years. And you see similar sentiment or similar data for the women from Beijing in 1995, the vulnerable, the minorities, and the single head of the households. Even so, the distribution is a little higher. You can see how in the women in Beijing in 1995 and the vulnerable groups, the issues of healthcare access for women, reproductive rights are obviously more important. You have almost 2/3 of women that report this as a priority number 1. But it's interesting to see the differences. So for the rural community women, is the issue of their rights. So human rights in all categories. And for girls, is violence. You have about 70% of girls who report this as being the top priority for them moving forward. And this not only entails trafficking of women and girls, it's also tech-based, technology-based, gender-based violence through social media that affects their self-image and causes mental health issues. But these are different findings. And then you see a toss-up between the distribution of the other 2, violence and economy, between the 2. So I think that in particular, the top 1 area of concern of choice, you can see the variability in the rural group and in the girls. So then the other questions at the end were, well, what do you think are the challenges for implementation of the Being platform? So here there's also these interesting differences by subgroup, but let's go over what's more important. So no surprise on this one, over half of all participants ranked the lack of political will as the most likely challenge for the implementation. And we got about 57, almost 60% of the respondents actually rated this as the most important, and followed by the lack of accountability and the government support. And what is interesting is that the CEDAW and the lack of funding were only rated by 1/3, but over half of the respondents in the survey rated political will. And when you look at the subgroups, you can see that the women in Beijing, those who are vulnerable, the rural communities and minorities, is about the same, 40-50% of the respondents in each group. So this was important, but this affected specifically the women who were single head of the household, because 3/4 of them reported this as the major challenge for implementation. And it goes along with the theme of the concerns for the health and economy and the pay gap and the need for social protections and family leave and daily childcare for them so they can actually work full-time and provide for their families. And the next question is, so what about the girls? Well, the girls didn't care about politics, and in a way, and it's kind of important to hear their voices because the girls are really in the communities, they're on social media, they're on TikTok, they see what's going on in their schools, on the streets, in the Barnes and Noble, in the Starbucks, on the train, or wherever they are. But for the girls, the most important challenge is the lack of public awareness. The fact that nobody knows, okay? And nobody knows that the Beijing platform exists. It's a framework for gender rights and the lack of knowledge about this. And this correlates with an important question at the beginning of the survey, which was asking, do you aware that, do you know what the Beijing platform is? And 40% of the respondents even have never heard about the Beijing platform in this survey. Only 60% of them had. So this is a target for implementing. This is a target for an initiative, which I know based on this answer, I recall that the Girl Scouts has done platforms and webinars to raise awareness in their schools and their communities. So what about emerging issues in the United States that are not in the Beijing platform? So we asked this question because over the last, since the Beijing platform was created in 1995, over the last few years, there have been new issues coming up. The issue of climate crisis. So even so there is an area of concern for the environment, doesn't specifically address how the climate crisis affect women in terms of education, gender inequality, economic issues, and also in terms of their mental health and how is that addressed. And the area concern about violence doesn't specifically have suggestions on how to address trafficking for women and girls. It touches upon the examples of what gender-based violence is, like childhood marriage, sexual assault, female genital mutilation, and trafficking, but it's not specifically addressed human trafficking of girls with separate objectives or suggestions or comments. So when we look at the data, we can see that over 60% of all survey participants rank the trafficking of women and girls as one of the most important emerging issues in the United States that are not in the Beijing platform. So this is honestly no surprise, as the as gender-based violence is one of the key top 3 priorities after health. Then comes the climate justice and gender inequalities and the intersectional inequalities. So I think intersectional inequalities is very critical because it demonstrates how all the different factors other than gender, let's say social status, economic status, place of residency, race and ethnicity, all come into play. And that's about half of the respondents. I mentioned this as one of the emerging issues not included that needs to be addressed. And after this, you have the other emerging issues like the technology, the gender identity, resources for feminism movements, and the menstrual poverty and stigma. So what happens when you look at these by subgroups? And some of these are going to stay the same, and some of them we're going to see what is more relevant for which groups. So when we look at trafficking, we clearly got about pretty much 80% of girls consider this as the most important issue, not there, and the women in the rural communities. So there are some quotes and some comments by women in rural communities about how there's no human rights and protections against sexual assaults and domestic violence. Then we look at climate justice. As you might expect, it will be the women in the rural communities who are more concerned about this as an emerging issue. And then it's the women from Beijing, which is about 70% of them report this as being a major issue is not addressed. So this confirms what you suspect people will say in the United States and globally. So it will be the people who live in the very far away areas in the farmlands, and it will be the women who have seen the lack of progress or no progress over 30 years that will have more concern about the climate issues. When you look at intersectional inequalities and factors, you have the girls, where about 60% of them report this as one of the emerging issues, and they were expressed not only the issues about the lack of awareness and the issue of gender, but they also, I remember reading in some of the quotations how they discuss the issue of the lack of not only awareness, but the social media. They discuss the discrimination by race and discrimination compared to boys, which is gender again, but also by economic status. saying how girls from the marginalized areas tend to have more issues with accessing even education or resources or help from the police and from the community leaders. And then technology, gender violence, or technology gender issues is mostly the girls, as you might expect. For feminist resources, you had the women from that were in Beijing, and the girls found this important. But again, menstrual poverty goes with voiced by the girls as a concern. But I figured the major message is these top three: the issues of trafficking, climate justice, and intersectional inequalities, and how some subgroups deem this more important for their groups and communities compared to the others. So the next chapter about this is to vary. So it's not all just data and numbers. We engaged the two young women and two girls to help us, and we wanted to include not only the voices from these young women, but also some of the quotes by area of concern that are important because you can all use this in your own organizations for any grassroots work. So let's hear from some of these women that help us. So these are the pictures of the 4 women and girls that help doing this, analyzing all this information and putting all this together over the summertime. So the question for them was, what is the Beijing platform important for women and girls in the United States? So let's see what Kaylee has to say.
It recognizes the intersectional inequalities faced by girls while giving young women a clear path towards equality.
This is Elena.
It is a framework to bring social justice, equal rights, and opportunities to women and girls in all their diversity.
And this is Maria Lisa. So Maria Lisa works in California with immigrants.
The Beijing Declaration is important because it acknowledges the challenges faced by young American women today and tracks progress towards a more equitable future.
And lastly is Denise. So Denise couldn't record this ahead of time. She actually has had a very busy time in the south part of California, helping refugees and to relocate the children of refugees who have been separated from their parents. So Denise mentioned that the Beijing platform demands gender justice, challenges systemic oppression, and affirms that every girl deserves safety, dignity, and equal opportunity to shape her own future. So they actually helped put this together. So the next few slides are a little long, but I'm just only going to highlight some of the key quotations that they actually put together for each area of concern in the United States. So some of these quotes you see are, for example, you look at poverty, we have quotations that they selected from the minority groups on women in the Beijing in 1995, from the vulnerable populations, the rural communities. So the key things that I think some of these group boys is among the minorities, they talk about the disadvantages from the socioeconomic classes, exacerbates discrimination. They specifically mention about the issue of homelessness and affordable housing for women and how women tend to be the ones with the high rates of poverty. You look at education and training on the right. The key issues are not about reducing the barriers, but also the importance of offering scholarships for women and girls in areas that are not traditionally open for men. And the girls in particular talk about how it's important to get education in finances and money. And I wanted to point 2 different things here. So being a mother of 2 teenage girls, one of them who is now in college, do you know how difficult it is to find scholarships for girls in college that are a significant amount of money and they are out there for women, no matter what area they are? It's impossible. So Elena applied to about 100 scholarships, out of which only 10 of them were specifically for girls or women in freshman year of college. And you could barely get $500 or $1,000 for that. But there were plenty of organizations that sponsor scholarships for boys, either in high school or in college. Like, I wish I had done a little survey of that or a little analysis on my own, because no matter what I looked, they give anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000 to $10,000. And it's all the brotherhoods, it's the local organizations, it's the schools, it's the colleges. So we need more. The bottom line is we need more funding for girls to go to school, for the schools and the training and the vocational degrees. And in general, there's not that many. There's a lot of STEM and AI classes in schools right now, to improve the digital skills. But overall, the amount of classes to help girls understand how to finance, how to manage their money and how understanding finances is very, very poor. So for women and girls, for health, the most important thing for the girls was sex education, which unfortunately is not very high in the United States, but also the issue of body autonomy, affordable care, and reproductive rights and sexual reproductive health seems to be the theme. Now, for violence against women, what really struck out to me was not only the issue of safety, but the issue about child marriage and genital mutilation. And I'm going to stop here just to tell you something that happened when I went to the UN headquarters in Geneva in October 2024. The Working Group for Violence Against Women presented a 5-minute video of childhood marriage in the United States. Okay, so the regional meeting for the Beijing Plus 30 involved all the European Union countries and the United States and Canada, but the only one they showed for violence was the United States. They didn't show any other countries. And it was really depressing and shocking to see. They did a video and they interviewed 5 girls from the United States that have been married to men against their consent within the United States without any protections since the age of 13, 14, or 15, and how they have been sexually assaulted every night, the violence, and it was just heartbreaking, and how many abortions they had and miscarriages. And this happens in the United States. So I was actually just reading on the one of the websites for one of the organizations that protects and has some data, and it specifically mentions how child marriage and genital mutilation are considered forms of violence, and we all know that, are supposed to be reported. But in the United States, there's no clear statistics, and there's no state or federal laws for protection, except for maybe 12 states that mandate that a child cannot be married under the age of 18, but the other 38 states don't have any laws and protections. And currently, there's about 600,000 girls for 5 years that are being engaged in childhood marriage, and there's no protection for them. So those are US numbers. That's what I mentioned here. This is about the armed conflict. And again, I was expecting to see more comments from women or girls about this, in specific, given the fact that it was reported no progress absolutely on armed conflict, but it kind of aligns with the lack of participation in peace processes and the wastefulness of resources and money for military expenditure. Women and the economy mostly is the minorities and the rural women who are concerned about the issues of daycare and maternal leave and the single head of the household. For the power and decision making, we have some quotes. But more importantly, what I found the trend is not only about leadership in politics and economic institutions, but also in corporate banking, like corporations. Not only politics, not only in legal frameworks, but also in every single type of corporations and academia. For institutional mechanisms, I think Denise put this in here about how implementation of the Equal Rights Amendments is the key to protect the gender rights, specifically for minority groups, and the people from the vulnerable groups are specifically addressed. That is important to revitalize the 2 key areas of concern from Beijing to improve gender equality. We're almost done. For the human rights, the vulnerable groups we're talking about how especially non-whites are marginalized in general, and their human rights are not protected. And again, the issue about making decisions about our own body is considered obviously a human right, and the intersection with women and health access. For women and the media, one of the things that was mentioned in general by the minorities is how women in journalism are underrepresented. And this is important because we want to raise awareness, which is the next quotation coming up by the single head of the household, is we need to make this known across the United States through social media, through media coverage, through news, through interviews. And this has a lot to do in terms of how we can raise awareness in general, not only for the social media campaigns, but also for marketing through platforms. women and the environment in the United States, not only getting to have more understanding about how the climate crisis is affecting women and girls, but also how it's affecting the morale, the mental health, and specifically done here is how the impact of climate changes in vulnerable women is not really addressed or supported by U.S. initiatives or policies. And those is a target for advocacy. And last, you look at the girl child, section L of the Beijing platform. Girls place a lot of importance on having adult mentors to continue support their young female leaders. So it's the effect of longitudinal role models and mentors, not only through a specific short period of time, like during the high school or college or later in career, but having somebody always continually guiding them. And again, it's talking about outlawing childhood marriage. And this is specifically in the rural communities. And what I found interesting is when I rewatched the video, somebody sent me the link again about the childhood marriages. It's interesting that 3 out of the 5 girls that were in this situation and abused for years happened to be live in the middle of the country, very far away from major cities, and were completely isolated from everyone. So I know it's a lot of information. So the next few slides is really the key messages from this whole survey, which I have put in here. So you look at the amount of progress in the Beijing platform since 1995, you're looking at all the participants. In general, each area of concern was rated as having only some or moderate progress, except for armed conflict, where it was rated as completely no progress by 1/3 of the participants. And you look by subgroups, again, is armed conflict and violence were rated as no progress over the last 30 years. In terms of the areas of concern that were rated as very important in our communities today, again, you look at all participants, you have number 1 is the issue of women and healthcare access, reproductive health, in particular maternal health, violence, meaning trafficking of women and girls again, and education. Looking at subgroups, you look at Beijing 1995 women, you have one of the important issues is the rights of the girl child. For girls is human rights in general, especially the protections for them. And then all the way to single head of the household, you look at the issues of economy because of the high poverty levels of this particular subset of women. When you look at what are the top 3 areas to be addressed for the next 5 years, and among all participants, again, you have health, violence, and the women and the economy. And in some particular subgroups, the number 1 priority for girls is issue of violence in their communities and human rights for the rural communities. For the most likely challenges against implementation for all participants is the lack of political will, which in the rural subgroup was ranked by 3/4 of the women who live in the rural communities. And for girls, it was the lack of public awareness being the major challenge for implementation. This is the last slide for summaries, looking at the most important emerging issues, not in the BPF. And again, all of them mention the women or girls. This is about 60% of participants. But then you're looking at subgroups, looking at the women who were in Beijing, is the climate justice. This is about, and I put the percentages that you can read, but it was climate justice again for women in Beijing. For girls was trafficking and intersectional inequalities. And you see how women in the vulnerable groups and rural communities, again, it was climate justice. Minorities look at the intersectional inequalities because their voices express the interaction of not only race and ethnicity, but also the lower socioeconomic status in terms of gender equality. And for single head of the household, again, is the trafficking of women and girls. So moving forward, what are my takes on all this information? So first of all, the result of this national survey identify alarming issues currently affecting the well-being of women and girls in the U.S. and that need to be addressed, meaning number 1, gender-based violence in the form of trafficking of women and girls. Number 2, health in terms of sexual education and reproductive rights. Number 3, the economic disparities, meaning addressing the pay gap, resources for maternal, family leave, and daycare. Now, due to the lack of political will, raising public awareness through social media, outlets, and local communities may be the most effective tool to educate our nation of the pervasive inequalities encountered by women and girls in the United States. So this data actually was validated some of the things that you might know by public opinion, but I'm glad that the numbers confirm a lot of the information that we got from here, specifically in particular subgroups such as girls and women in the rural communities and women who are single out of the household, right? So the data for the survey supports initiatives that align with the upcoming CSW 70 to bring justice to women and girls that are affected by gender-based violence, trafficking, economic inequalities, and who are deprived of their reproductive rights. So when I finished the preliminary data analysis sometime in the beginning of the summer, and I started getting the reports that have been submitted by members of the U.S. Women Caucus. I was very glad to see that the trafficking of women and girls was the first one, and then we had the other ones in terms of abortion rights and so forth that align with the information that was found in this particular survey. So I want to really thank, this is my last slide of acknowledgments. So again, I want to thank the members of the subcommittee for the survey and for all their guidance. And in particular, I want to extend a big thank to the young women and girls who helped us. Katie Peterson, she is currently applying for college. She's a senior in high school, and she's a member of the youth group for the Women Caucus. And she's applying for global health because she wants to be a pre-med. Denise, again, who is here in this picture on the right, she works 24/7 helping relocating refugees and children who are refugees without any funding. And she's showing here in this picture this lady with the blue jacket or the blue coat. Her name is Miss Huertas, who is a big advocate for women's rights and immigrants in California. Elena is my older daughter. She was a girl advocate through the Working Group on Girls for the last 3 years, and she helped put some of this information together. She's studying political science and international studies. And Maria Rodriguez, she's a social worker and has a sociology degree. She works in California, also with Denise in the same organization, helping immigrants and refugees. So thank you very much, and we'll take some questions and comments from you guys.
Wow. Okay. That was excellent. It was an excellent presentation. There's so much information in there. It's amazing. But let's open it up for questions. Okay. Let's see. Alex, do you want to open it up? Do you have some questions that were in the chat?
There were actually no questions, but just a lot of
Comments.
comments
Yeah.
and references.
Okay. Well, how about some questions right now from the group?
So first of all, I just want to mention that the slides are going to be sent to everyone. We're also going to post them probably on the U.S. Women Caucus site, right? And the other thing I want to mention is for anybody who wants to use, obviously there's more information that we gathered from the survey than what is presented on the PowerPoint slide. The PowerPoint slide is a summary. So for anyone who does research for, let's say, particular areas of concern, yes, somebody who does advocacy in terms of women and health or poverty or violence, or by subgroups that we have, I actually have Word documents for each one of them that has all the information separately. Mm-hmm. So that can also be circulated in the one that it has all the has all the data and information, see when they want to get that information too.